The land itself was a testament to endurance, a sprawling canvas of scorched earth where the sun bled across the horizon, painting the jagged mesas in hues of rust and blood. Redemption Gulch was a town carved from this unforgiving landscape, a single dusty street lined with buildings that leaned into each other like weary drunks. It was a place where hope came to die, or if you were lucky to be reborn as something harder, something calloused enough to survive. Thomas Calder felt the weight of that survival every time he rode into town for supplies. He was a man built of silence and solitude, his face a roadmap of sorrows he never spoke of, etched by a sun that had bleached all softness from his features. He moved with the quiet economy of a predator, his eyes missing nothing, his hands resting near the worn leather of his gun belt, not out of aggression, but habit, the lingering ghost of a life he had tried to bury. He was inside the Redemption Savings and Trust, a grand name, for a squat stone building that smelled of stale ink and desperation when the world shattered. The swing doors burst open with a violent crack, and 3 men spilled inside, their faces obscured by grimy bandanas, their pistols leveled with a practiced menace. Dust and sunlight swirled around them, framing them like apparitions from a hellish dream. Nobody moves. And the leader's voice boomed sharp and cultured a jarring note in the symphony of rough-hewn fear. This is a transaction, nothing more. Your cooperation will be rewarded with your lives. Resistance will be re-evaluated. Panic erupted. The bank teller, a young man with more fear than sense, fumbled with his hands raised. An old rancher dropped his coin purse with a clatter that sounded as loud as a gunshot. In the corner, a woman's soft gasp was cut short. Thomas instinctively flattened himself against the far wall, his mind a cold, calculating machine, assessing threats, exits, and the folly of heroism. He had sworn off that life. He had traded his guns for an axe and his name for anonymity. It was then he saw her. Tucked away near the manager's office was a woman in a heavy-wheeled chair, its dark wood a stark contrast to her pale face. Her hands, delicate and trembling, were clasped in her lap over the distinct swell of a pregnancy. Her eyes, the color of a storm-tossed sea, were wide with a terror so profound it seemed to pull all the air from the room. She wasn't just afraid for herself. She was afraid for the life she carried. One of the robbers, a brutish man with impatient hands, shoved the old rancher aside. The man stumbled backward, crashing into a heavy desk. The impact sent an oil lamp toppling. It shattered on the floorboards, and a stray bullet from another robber's nervous trigger finger ripped through the air, striking the wall just above the woman's head. The window beside her exploded inward, showering her in a glittering rain of broken glass. She cried out a sound of pure, unadulterated fear, her arms flying up to shield her belly. In that instant, the ghost of the man Thomas Calder used to be awoke. Before thought could form, before his vow of solitude could chain him down, he moved. He crossed the floor in 2 long strides, his body a shield, and pulled her wheelchair back and out of the line of fire, tucking her into the relative safety of an alcove. "Stay down," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. The chaos intensified. The leader, his voice now laced with cold fury, barked orders. "Get the money quickly." In the lurching movement of shielding the woman, something heavy slipped from Thomas's shirt pocket. A small silver locket tarnished with age, and the sweat of his hands hit the dusty floorboards with a soft thud. It lay there for a heartbeat, a relic of a buried life, engraved with a single faded rose. It held the only image he owned of his late wife, a smiling face he was starting to forget. Before he could retrieve it, a polished boot stepped down beside it. The leader of the gang, Carter Vance, bent down with an almost feline grace. He plucked the locket from the floor, his gloved fingers brushing the dust from its surface. He didn't open it. He simply held it, his eyes dark and intelligent over the rim of his bandana, fixing on Thomas. A sentimental man, Vance mused, his voice a low purr that cut through the noise. How utterly predictable. He tucked the locket into his own vest pocket as his men finished stuffing canvas bags with cash. Consider this a fee for my inconvenience. With a final chilling glance that lingered on Thomas and then on the terrified woman in the wheelchair, Vance and his men backed out of the bank and vanished into the unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun. For a long moment, the only sound was the ragged breathing of the survivors and the quiet, desperate sobs of the woman Thomas had saved. He looked down at her, this stranger who had inadvertently dragged him back into the world of violence he'd fled. Her name was Clara Wren, though he did not know it yet. All he knew was the hollow ache in his chest where the locket used to be, and the sudden terrifying weight of a connection he had never sought. The past was not buried. It had just been stolen. The ride to his cabin was a study in silence, broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of his horse Atlas. Thomas had secured Clara's modest cart to the back of his own, her wheeled chair wedged firmly in place. She had not spoken a word since the sheriff had finished his perfunctory questioning, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if searching for an escape that didn't exist. The town of Redemption Gulch, shaken but ultimately relieved, had offered her little more than pitying glances. No one wanted the burden of a pregnant, crippled woman, especially not one who had been at the epicenter of such violence. Thomas had made his decision without a word. He had simply loaded her belongings, a single worn valise, and guided his horse toward the winding trail that led up into the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains. It was an act born not of kindness, but of a grim necessity. He could not leave her to the mercy of a town that had none. His cabin was not a home. It was a hermitage, a place where every object held a story of solitude. The worn handle of the axe by the door spoke of countless winters spent alone. The single tin cup by the hearth whispered of meals eaten in silence. The floorboards hewn by his own hands groaned like a lonely man's sigh. It was a fortress built to keep the world out, yet he had just willingly carried a piece of it over his threshold. He maneuvered her chair inside the wheels, catching on the uneven planks. The space was sparse but clean, dominated by a stone fireplace and the scent of pine and wood smoke. Clara finally looked around, her gaze taking in the bare-bones functionality of his life. Her shoulders slumped, the weight of her shame palpable. "You didn't have to do this," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "I'm accustomed to being an inconvenience." Thomas didn't reply immediately. He stoked the dying embers in the hearth, coaxing them back to life, until a warm orange glow pushed back the encroaching shadows of dusk. "Ain't an inconvenience," he said, his back to her. "Just quiet." He learned her story in fragments pieced together from hesitant sentences offered over a bowl of thin stew. Her name was Clara Wren. She had been on her way east, hoping to find a distant cousin when her funds ran out in Redemption Gulch. She spoke of a suitor she was fleeing, a man whose charm had curdled into a suffocating possessiveness. She described him as a man who promised protection, but delivered a cage. "He said he would care for me." She explained, her eyes downcast, tracing the rim of her bowl. But his care felt like ownership. "When I told him I was with child, and that I could not be the wife he wanted, a wife who could stand beside him, he became someone else. Someone cold." She never mentioned his name, but Thomas knew. The cultured voice, the chilling possessiveness, it was the man from the bank. Carter Vance. He had not been robbing a bank. He had been hunting. As night fell, a profound weariness settled over Clara. Thomas prepared the single cot in the corner for her, adding his own bedroll for extra padding. He helped her from the chair, his movements careful and impersonal. Yet the brief contact sent a jolt through him, a reminder of human warmth he had long since denied himself. Her legs were limp, her body a dead weight, held up only by the strength in her arms and the fierce set of her jaw. He retreated to a stool by the fire, the rifle resting across his knees, and watched as she drifted into an uneasy sleep. The firelight played across her face, softening the lines of fear and exhaustion. He saw not a burden, but a resilience that mirrored the stubborn desert flowers that bloomed in the rockiest soil. His hand went unconsciously to his chest, to the empty space where the locket had been. It was more than silver and a faded photograph. It was his penance, a tangible reminder of the duel in Sonora, of the man he had killed, and of the wife whose death had sent him spiraling into this self-imposed exile. He had killed a man, and in the ensuing grief and chaos, his pregnant wife, Eleanor, had fallen, losing both her life and the life of their unborn child. He had traded his gunslinger's life for one of silent atonement, believing himself unworthy of companionship or peace. And now, Carter Vance held that atonement in his pocket. The robbery had not been about money. It was a message. Vance knew who he was. The thought sent a chill down his spine, colder than any mountain winter. He looked at the sleeping woman, the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the precious life she protected. He had pulled her from the line of fire, only to place her directly in the path of a storm aimed squarely at him. He had not saved her. He had merely taken her hostage from a different captor. 3 days passed in a tense, fragile quiet. The mountain air was crisp, and the silence was broken only by the cry of a hawk or the rustle of wind through the pines. Thomas watched the trail leading to his cabin with a hawk's intensity, but the world seemed to have forgotten them. Inside the cabin, a tentative rhythm began to form. Thomas would perform his chores, chopping wood, checking his snares, tending to Atlas, while Clara would sit by the fire, her hands busy mending his worn shirts with small, precise stitches. The silence between them was not awkward, but full. It was the silence of two people who had seen the worst of the world and found a temporary ceasefire in each other's presence. He learned to read her needs without words, a fresh cup of water, an extra blanket when the night grew cold. She in turn seemed to understand his need for space, for long periods of staring into the fire, where he wrestled with ghosts she could not see. On the third evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple, the peace shattered. It began with the distant, rhythmic thud of hoofbeats, too many for a lone rider. Thomas was instantly on his feet, his hand closing around the rifle propped against the wall. "Get away from the window," he said, his voice low and urgent. Clara's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with renewed terror. He saw the question in them, the one she was too afraid to ask. "Is it him?" He didn't have to answer. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, their silhouettes dark against the fading light. They were not Vance's men from the bank, but they had the same hard, predatory look. They stopped just at the edge of the clearing, a clear and deliberate challenge. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his cheek, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Calder," he yelled the name echoing in the thin air. It was a confirmation of Thomas's deepest fear. They knew him. "Our boss, Mr. Vance, sent us with a message. He wants the woman. Says she belongs to him. Send her out and we ride away peaceful." Thomas stepped onto the small porch, the rifle held loosely at his side. He was a single man against 3, but his stance held no fear, only a cold, unshakable resolve. "She ain't property," Thomas called back, his voice, a low growl that carried surprisingly far. "And she ain't going anywhere." The man with the scar laughed a harsh grating sound. "Vance figured you'd be stubborn. Said a man like you can't resist a lost cause." He spat on the ground. He ain't asking for your permission. He's telling you how it is. That woman has a debt to pay, and he always collects. Thomas raised the rifle slightly, the message clear. Tell Vance this cabin ain't for collecting. It's for burying trespassers. A tense silence stretched between the cabin and the riders. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the clearing into a deep, foreboding twilight. For a moment, Thomas thought they would charge. He could feel Clara's terrified gaze on his back from inside the cabin. Finally, the scarred man shook his head, a smirk twisting his lips. Have it your way, gunslinger. Vance said you'd need persuading. He wheeled his horse around. He'll be in touch. The three men melted back into the forest, leaving behind an oppressive silence more threatening than their words. Thomas remained on the porch for a long time, the cold seeping into his bones. This was no longer just a confrontation, it was a declaration of war. Carter Vance was not just coming for Clara. He was coming for Thomas Calder, and he intended to use her as the weapon to tear Thomas's world apart. He stepped back inside, bolting the heavy wooden door behind him. The sound of the bolt sliding home was a final deafening click. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was a siege. The next morning, Thomas rode down the mountain, the rising sun at his back. The decision had been made in the sleepless hours of the night, watching the fire die to embers. He couldn't win a siege. He was low on ammunition and supplies, and Clara's time was drawing near. He needed information, and he needed the law. Redemption Gulch was his only option. He left Clara with a loaded pistol and a solemn promise. Keep the door barred. Don't open it for anyone. Shoot at anything that ain't me. She had nodded, her face pale, but her eyes determined. My legs may be broken, Thomas, she'd said, her voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. But my will is not. The town felt different. The usual morning bustle was muted, replaced by an undercurrent of fear. People averted their eyes as Thomas rode down the main street. Doors that were usually open were shut tight. Carter Vance's shadow had fallen over this place, long and cold. Thomas tethered Atlas outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside. Sheriff Brody was a man past his prime, with a weary face and a gut that strained the buttons of his vest. He looked up from his paperwork, his expression souring when he saw Thomas. Calder, Brody grunted. Figured you'd be trouble the moment you brought that woman back from the bank. Vance's men paid me a visit last night, Thomas said, getting straight to the point. They want Clara. Said she belongs to him. Brody sighed, running a hand over his balding head. He leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. And what do you want me to do about it? Carter Vance owns half this territory one way or another. The freight contracts, the mining rights. He's got his hooks in deep. People around here know better than to cross him. He's threatening an innocent woman. That's your business, Sheriff. Is she innocent? Brody shot back, his eyes narrowing. Or is she a woman who ran out on a powerful man and brought his wrath down on all of us? All I know is this town was quiet before she showed up. Before you got involved. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Thomas felt a familiar anger rise in his chest, the old hot-tempered rage he had worked so hard to bury. So, you're just going to let him do whatever he wants? I'm going to keep this town from getting burned to the ground, Brody said, his voice dropping. Look, Calder, I know your reputation. I know about Sonora. You're a man who draws trouble like a corpse draws flies. My advice to you, give Vance the woman. It ain't your fight. It is now, Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned and walked out, the sheriff's weary resignation, a heavier blow than any threat. The law would not help him. He was on his own. He made his way to the general store for supplies. But the proprietor suddenly remembered he was fresh out of cartridges for Thomas's rifle. At the livery, no one would sell him grain for his horse. The town had closed ranks not in defiance of Vance, but in fear of him. Thomas was an outsider, an inconvenience, and they were cutting him loose to save themselves. Defeated, he turned toward the one place he thought might offer a sliver of humanity, the office of Doc Miller. The doctor was an old grizzled man, with kind eyes and hands stained with a lifetime of mending the broken bodies of Redemption Gulch. Doc Miller listened patiently as Thomas explained the situation, his expression growing more grave with each word. "Carter Vance is a snake," the doctor said. When Thomas was finished, his voice a low rumble. "A charming, well-spoken snake, which is the most dangerous kind. He's been courting Clara Wren for months. She came to me once for a fall. Had a bruise on her arm in the perfect shape of a man's hand. She claimed she was clumsy, but I know the look of a terrified woman when I see one." The doctor's words confirmed the darkness Clara had only hinted at. Vance wasn't a spurned suitor. He was an abuser. "The sheriff won't help," Thomas stated flatly. "Brody's a good man, but he's afraid Doc Miller's side. Vance has a way of reminding people of what they stand to lose. A business, a home, a daughter." The doctor stood and walked to a locked cabinet. He pulled out a dusty box and placed it on the table. "This is all the extra ammunition I have. It ain't much, but it's more than you had. I'll also give you some laudanum and bandages. For the woman. Her time is close and a birth after a fright like she's had. It won't be easy." Thomas took the supplies, a heavy gratitude settling in his chest. "Thank you, Doc." "Don't thank me." Miller set his gaze serious. "Just keep her safe. A woman like that with that kind of spirit. She's a rare thing in a place like this. She deserves to see her child grow up." Riding out of Redemption Gulch. Thomas felt the full weight of his isolation. The town was a fortress of fear, and he and Clara were on the outside. But Doc Miller's small act of defiance had given him something more valuable than bullets. It had given him a flicker of hope. He spurred Atlas on, racing the setting sun back to the cabin on the mountain, back to the woman who was waiting for him. The fight was far from over, but now at least he knew he wasn't entirely alone in it. Back in the cabin, the world shrank to the space between four walls. With the town turned against him, Thomas knew their only defense was to make his small patch of land impregnable. He spent his days reinforcing the cabin, wedging stones into the gaps in the foundation and boarding up the smaller back window entirely. The front window and the door were fitted with heavy bars that could be dropped into place, turning the cabin from a home into a makeshift pillbox. Clara watched him work, her silence a heavy presence. The initial terror had subsided, replaced by a quiet, simmering resolve. She insisted on contributing spending hours cleaning and oiling his spare revolver until the metal gleamed. One afternoon, as he was testing the new bar on the door, she spoke. "Teach me," she said, her voice clear and firm. Thomas turned. "Teach you what?" "How to shoot," she said, nodding toward the pistol on the table. "I will not be helpless. I will not be the reason you die. If they come through that door, I want to be more than just something you have to protect." He hesitated. The thought of putting a gun in her hands, of bringing her fully into the violent world he was trying to shield her from, felt like a failure. But as he looked at the fierce determination in her eyes, he saw his own pride for what it was. She was not asking for permission. He spent the next 2 days teaching her. He set up a target, a tin can on a fence post, and then showed her how to handle the pistol from her chair, how to brace her arm against its frame for stability, how to line up the sights, how to control her breathing. Her first few shots were wild, the kick of the gun jarring her small frame. But she did not give up. She fired again and again, her jaw set, her focus absolute, until she could reliably hit the can from across the clearing. With each successful shot, a piece of the victim fell away, replaced by a warrior. Their bond deepened in these shared moments of preparation. The walls between them, built of his guilt and her shame, began to crumble. They spoke more freely in the evenings, sharing stories of lives lived before their paths had crossed. He told her about the farm he grew up on, about the feel of cool earth in his hands. He spoke of his wife Eleanor, but only in fleeting, painful glimpses, her laugh at the way she braided her hair. He never mentioned how she died. Clara, in turn, told him of her dreams, of being a teacher of a small schoolhouse filled with the sound of children's laughter. She spoke of the accident that had taken the use of her legs 5 years prior, a runaway carriage, and how the world had slowly recategorized her from a woman into an object of pity. Carter was the first man who didn't look at me with pity, she confessed one night, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at me with hunger. I mistook it for passion. It wasn't until later I realized he wasn't interested in my heart. He wanted to own my strength because he couldn't stand that a broken woman still had any. As the days turned into a week, Vance's intimidation escalated. It was a war of nerves. One morning, they found a dead crow on the porch, a single black feather tucked under its wing, a symbol of death. Another time, a rider galloped past the clearing in the dead of night, firing a single shot into the air that left them both awake and on edge until dawn. It was clear Vance was enjoying this, drawing it out, savoring Thomas's defiance, like a fine wine before the final brutal act. Thomas began to suspect it was more than just about Clara. Vance knew his name. He knew he was a gunslinger. The taunts from his men confirmed it. This felt personal, a ghost from his past, reaching out to strangle his present. The breaking point came a week after his trip to town. Thomas was at the small creek refilling their water barrels when he sensed he was not alone. He didn't reach for his gun. He simply straightened up slowly and turned. Carter Vance stood at the edge of the trees, leaning casually against a pine. He was alone, dressed not as a bandit, but as a gentleman in a tailored coat and polished boots. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need one. His presence was weapon enough. Calder Vance said, his voice smooth and pleasant, as if they were old acquaintances. I admire your fortitude. Truly. But it's time for this foolishness to end. It ends when you ride out of this territory and never come back, Thomas replied, his hand now resting on the butt of his pistol. Vance smiled, a slow, predatory curve of his lips. He pushed himself off the tree and took a few steps closer. Oh, I'm not going anywhere. You see, this was never just about Clara. She was merely the catalyst. A lovely, tragic catalyst, I'll admit. This is about you and me. It's about a debt. I don't owe you anything. Vance's smile widened. He reached into his vest and pulled out the silver locket. It dangled from his fingers, catching the afternoon light. Not me, perhaps. But you owe my family. You owe my brother. He let the words hang in the air, watching Thomas's face for the first crack in his composure. You don't remember him, do you? So many men you've put in the ground? But perhaps you remember the place. A dusty cantina. A duel in Sonora. My brother's name was Daniel Vance. The name hit Thomas like a physical blow. Daniel Vance. A loudmouthed card cheat who had called Thomas out. It had been a fair duel, but the memory was still soaked in blood and regret. It was the last duel he ever fought. Your brother drew first? Thomas said, his voice a strained rasp. A matter of perspective, Carter purred, echoing the same words he'd used in the bank. From my perspective, you murdered the only family I had left. I was just a boy, but I swore I'd find you. Imagine my surprise when I learned the infamous Thomas Calder had vanished only to re-emerge as a hermit on a mountain hiding from his own shadow. And then fate delivered Clara to me. So wounded, so defiant. When she fled from me and ran straight to you, it was poetry. You took my brother. I will take everything you value, starting with her. The truth was a cold, venomous thing. Clara was not the prize. She was the battlefield. Vance's obsession, his cruelty, it was all a twisted performance designed to break Thomas. She has nothing to do with this, Thomas growled. She has everything to do with this, Vance's voice snapped, the charming facade cracking to reveal the raw, obsessive hatred beneath. I will take her. I will raise that child as my own, and every day it will be a living testament to my victory over you. I will destroy your quiet little world, Calder. I will burn it to the ground and salt the earth. He tossed the locket into the creek. It landed with a soft splash and disappeared beneath the current. The gesture was clear. He didn't need the memento anymore. He had the man. It's time to end this, Vance said, his composure restored. Be in Redemption Gulch by sunset tomorrow, or I'll start taking the town apart piece by piece until you come down from this mountain. Your choice. He turned and walked back into the trees, leaving Thomas standing by the creek, the sound of the running water a mocking whisper. The ghost of Sonora had found him, and it demanded a final bloody payment. The air grew heavy and still charged with the suffocating pressure that precedes a storm. On the horizon, a bruised yellow line of dust began to gather, a promise of the fury to come. Thomas returned to the cabin, the weight of Vance's ultimatum pressing down on him. He didn't tell Clara the full truth, not about Sonora, not about Vance's brother. He couldn't bring himself to place the burden of his past sins squarely on her shoulders. He simply told her that Vance had forced his hand. He wants me in town by sunset, Thomas said, his voice grim. He's going to make his move. Clara's hand went to her belly, a protective, instinctual gesture. You can't go. It's a trap. It's a trap whether I go or stay, he replied, checking his rifle for the dozenth time. If I stay here, he'll bring an army. If I go to him, I can choose the ground. But Vance was not a man to let his opponent choose anything. As the afternoon wore on, a rider came at a full gallop up the mountain trail. He didn't stop but threw a rolled-up piece of paper onto the porch before disappearing back down the path. Thomas retrieved it. The note was brief, its script an elegant, cruel slash. A change of plans, Calder. I find I require a more compelling form of leverage. I've taken the saloon, and Sheriff Brody's daughter. Her name is Sarah. Be in the town square by sunset, or she pays your debt. The choice is no longer yours. The world tilted. Vance had escalated the conflict from a personal vendetta to an act of public terror. He was holding an innocent girl hostage, forcing Thomas into an impossible position. He now had to walk into a town that feared him to face a dozen guns to save a girl he didn't know all, while the woman he loved was hours away from giving birth. And on the horizon, the sandstorm grew, a monstrous churning wall of grit and wind. I have to go, Thomas said, his voice hollow. He looked at Clara, at the terror and strength warring in her eyes. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it until I come back. You will come back, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a command. A prayer. He knelt before her chair, his hand resting gently on her cheek. I promise, he whispered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. It was a promise he had no right to make. He rode Atlas down the mountain, not as a hermit, but as the gunslinger he once was. The wind whipped at his face, carrying the first stinging grains of sand. The sky turned a sickly orange. The world was holding its breath, waiting for the coming violence. He reached the outskirts of Redemption Gulch as the first great wave of the storm hit. The sun vanished, swallowed by a swirling vortex of sand. Visibility dropped to mere feet. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at signs and shutters. The town became a labyrinth of howling wind and blinding dust. It was chaos. It was hell. And for Thomas Calder, it was cover. He dismounted, leaving Atlas in the relative shelter of the livery. He pulled his bandana up over his face, the grit already coating his teeth. He moved through the storm like a ghost, using the maelstrom as his cloak. Vance's men posted as lookouts were blinded, their shouted warnings swallowed by the wind. Thomas saw them as fleeting shapes in the brown haze, a man huddled in a doorway, another squinting from a rooftop. He was a phantom, his pistol striking with lethal precision from the heart of the storm. 2 of Vance's men went down before they even knew he was there. The sandstorm, meant to be a backdrop for Vance's grand finale, had become Thomas's greatest ally. He made his way to the back of the saloon. The windows were dark, the sounds from within muffled by the roaring wind. He could hear Vance's voice, a faint, angry thread in the tapestry of chaos. He found a loose board on a side wall, a delivery chute for beer barrels, and slipped inside. The saloon was a cavern of shadows, lit by a few swaying lanterns. Vance stood at the main bar, a pistol in one hand, and the other gripping the arm of a terrified young woman, Sarah Brody. The sheriff was there, disarmed and helpless, his face a mask of anguish. Doc Miller was present as well, his bag on the floor, likely summoned by Vance to add a veneer of legitimacy to his madness. The remaining handful of Vance's men were jumpy, their eyes darting toward the howling gale outside. He should be here. Vance raged, his composure finally fraying. He wouldn't abandon an innocent girl. Maybe the storm got him, one of his men suggested nervously. The storm is his ally, you fool, Vance snarled. From the shadows, Thomas spoke, his voice calm and clear. He's here, Vance. Every head snapped in his direction. For a heartbeat, there was stunned silence, broken only by the screaming wind. Vance recovered first, a slow, malevolent smile spreading across his face. He shoved Sarah toward the sheriff, his attention now completely fixed on Thomas. Calder, he breathed. Always the dramatic entrance. I should have known. Let them go, Vance, Thomas said, stepping into the dim lantern light. This is between us. It always has been, Vance agreed, raising his pistol. This is for Daniel. He fired. Thomas dove behind an overturned card table as the bullets splintered the wood where his head had been. The saloon erupted into a frenzy of gunfire. Thomas returned fire, his shots precise, aimed to disable, not to kill. He had killed enough. But as the battle raged, something unexpected happened. Doc Miller, seeing his chance, lunged not at Vance, but toward the sheriff. Brody, listen to me, he yelled over the din. You've got to know the truth. Vance, distracted, turned his fire on the doctor, but Sheriff Brody pulled the old man to safety. What truth? The sheriff demanded. Daniel Vance. The doctor gasped, pressing himself against the floor. I was the one who stitched him up after his father was through with him. He was a monster. He beat Daniel, and Daniel beat Carter. That whole family was poison, and the man Thomas killed wasn't an innocent victim. He was a violent, drunken brute who would have killed his own brother in time. The words struck Carter Vance harder than any bullet. He froze, his face contorting in a mask of disbelief and rage. Lies, he screamed. My brother was a good man. He was all I had. He was a reflection of the evil you were raised in, Doc Miller retorted. your entire crusade, your revenge. It's all built on a self-serving lie to make you feel like a righteous victim instead of what you really are. Another bitter, violent Vance. In that moment of stunned silence, as Vance's world crumbled around him, Thomas saw his opening. He didn't fire. He lunged forward, tackling Vance, sending them both crashing to the floor. The fight was brutal and close quarters. It wasn't about guns anymore. It was about raw, desperate will. Thomas was driven by the need to protect Vance, by the need to preserve his fractured reality. Thomas finally gained the upper hand, his fist connecting with Vance's jaw. The man's pistol skittered across the floor. Sheriff Brody, galvanized by the doctor's revelation and the sight of his daughter safe, finally acted. He scooped up the gun and aimed it squarely at Vance. "It's over," Carter Brody said, his voice shaking but firm. Vance lay on the floor, defeated, his face a ruin of hatred and shattered illusions. Thomas rose, his chest heaving. He had won. He had faced the ghost of Sonora and discovered it was not his own guilt that haunted him, but another man's lie. He was free. The roar of the storm outside seemed to lessen, its fury spent. The climax was over. All that was left was the aftermath. As the sandstorm's fury subsided, it left behind a world transformed. The wind's scream softened to a mournful whisper, and a strange ethereal light filtered through the dust-choked air, bathing Redemption Gulch in an amber glow. The silence inside the saloon was profound, broken only by Sarah Brody's quiet sobs as she clung to her father. Sheriff Brody kept his pistol trained on Carter Vance, who remained on the floor, his face a canvas of disbelief and simmering rage. The truth had not liberated him. It had imprisoned him in the wreckage of his own hatred. "Get him on his feet," Brody ordered his deputy, who had emerged from cover. The townspeople, drawn by the sudden silence, began to gather at the saloon doors, their faces a mixture of fear and awe as they peered into the dimly lit room. Thomas stood apart, the adrenaline slowly draining from his body, leaving a deep, bone-weary exhaustion in its place. He looked at Vance, a man hollowed out by a false narrative, and felt not triumph, but a profound sense of pity. Sheriff Brody walked over to Thomas, his expression humbled. "Calder, Ike, I was wrong about you. I let fear cloud my judgment. What you did here today, for my daughter, for this town." He trailed off, unable to find the right words. "Thank you." Thomas simply nodded, his gaze drifting toward the door. His thoughts were not on victory or vengeance, but on the cabin on Clara. As if on cue, one of the ranchers from the crowd pushed his way inside, his face streaked with dust and urgency. "Sheriff Doc, it's the woman up at the Calder cabin. Her time's come. I was checking my livestock on the high trail when the storm broke, and I heard her crying out." Thomas's heart seized. He was across the room in an instant, grabbing his gun belt from the floor. "Doc, I need you." "I'm right behind you," Miller said, already snatching up his medical bag. Vance, being hauled to his feet by the deputy, let out a final broken laugh. "Go on, Calder. Run to her. Maybe you'll get to watch this one die too." Thomas didn't even flinch. Vance's words were empty now, the venom of a defeated snake. He pushed through the crowd and out into the storm's aftermath, with Doc Miller struggling to keep pace. The world was still and quiet, the air thick with the smell of wet dust and a coming peace. He untethered Atlas and mounted his mind a singular prayer. Let me be in time. The ride back to the cabin was a frantic, desperate race against the fading light. When they finally reached the clearing, Thomas's blood ran cold. The cabin door was ajar. He leapt from his horse rifle in hand, fearing the worst. He burst inside to find Clara, pale and drenched in sweat, but alive. She was propped up in her chair, her face a mask of agony, but her eyes lit up with relief when she saw him. "Thomas," she gasped, her voice strained. "The baby, it's coming." The hours that followed were a blur of pain and prayer, of boiled water and whispered reassurances. With Doc Miller's steady hands and Thomas's unwavering presence, Clara fought the final, most important battle of her life. She fought with a strength that defied her broken body, a raw, primal force driven by love for the child she was bringing into the world. And then, just as the first stars began to pierce the dusty twilight, a new sound filled the small cabin. Not the cry of pain, but the thin, piercing wail of a newborn. A daughter. Doc Miller cleaned the infant and wrapped her in a soft blanket, placing her gently in Clara's arms. Clara wept tears of joy and exhaustion streaming down her face as she looked upon her child. She was perfect. Thomas stood back, his throat tight with an emotion so powerful it threatened to break him. He watched Clara kiss her daughter's forehead, her face radiant, and knew in that moment that he was home. He had walked through fire and faced down his ghosts, not for redemption, but for this. For them. Months later, peace had settled over the mountain cabin like a soft blanket of snow. Spring had come to the high country, breathing life back into the scorched land. Wildflowers, resilient and vibrant, bloomed in the cracks between the rocks. The cabin, its scars now weathered and faint, felt less like a fortress and more like a home. The air was filled not with silence, but with the soft coos of a baby girl they named Hope, and the quiet, easy laughter of two people who had found their harbor in one another. Carter Vance was gone, sentenced to a federal prison, where he would be forced to live with the truth of his own, making a fate Thomas knew that was far worse for him than a quick death. Redemption Gulch had slowly returned to its dusty, quiet self, but with a newfound respect for the silent man on the mountain. One afternoon, Sheriff Brody rode up the trail, his horse moving at a relaxed pace. He dismounted, hat in hand, and accepted the cup of coffee Thomas offered him on the porch. Hope was asleep in a cradle Thomas had carved from a fallen pine, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. "Town's been quiet," Brody said, taking a sip of coffee. "Too quiet. I came to offer you a job, Thomas. A permanent position as my deputy. This territory needs a man like you." Thomas looked from the sheriff to the cradle, then to the open doorway, where Clara sat in her chair, a gentle smile on her face. He had been offered a chance to reclaim a part of his old life, to wear a badge and carry a gun for the law. For a moment, the old instinct stirred. But then he looked at his daughter, at the woman who had taught him that strength was not about standing, but about refusing to fall. He had already found his purpose. "I appreciate the offer," Sheriff Thomas said, his voice warm and steady. "But my fighting days are over. I've got everything I need right here." Brody nodded, a knowing smile on his face. "I figured as much. Just know the offer stands." He finished his coffee, tipped his hat to Clara, and rode away, leaving them to their peaceful solitude. That evening, as the sun set, casting long, gentle shadows across the porch, Thomas went to a small wooden chest in the corner of the cabin. He opened it and took out the silver locket. Sheriff Brody had recovered it from Vance's possessions and returned it to him weeks ago. He had not opened it since, did. He carried it, not to the chest to be buried again, but to the wall beside his daughter's cradle. He hammered a small nail into the wood and hung the locket there where the last rays of sunlight made the silver gleam. Eleanor's face was a part of his past, a memory of love and loss that had shaped him. But it was no longer a ghost to be hidden away in darkness. It was a part of the story that had led him here to this new life, this new family, this unexpected and profound redemption. Clara wheeled herself over her hand, coming to rest on his arm. She looked at the locket, then at him, her eyes full of understanding. "A man's defined by who he stands for," she whispered, echoing the words he had once spoken. Thomas turned his hand, covering hers. He looked at his wife, his daughter, and the home they had built from the ashes of their broken pasts. He was no longer a man in hiding. He was a husband and a father. He was whole.